Recent research has shown that feeding your dog a vegan dog food is actually healthier than feeding them a raw diet. And that in turn is healthier than feeding them a conventional cooked commercial diet, so a kibble or a canned food. But is this the whole truth? Is there more to it than this seemingly simple and conclusive message? Well, I spoke with researcher Dr. Andrew Knight to find out more.
Well, so today we're talking about kind of vegan pet food for dogs and the paper that you've recently published, kind of comparing the health of dogs that have been fed a vegan food compared to raw diets, as well as our more conventional cooked diets. But before we kind of jump into the meat of that, so to speak, I'd just love to know kind of your background and what led to your interest in kind of the vegan pet food and how you came to be studying this.
Sure. I mean, I have been interested for a long time in the environmental impacts of the livestock sector, which have been increasing. We now know that the food system globally is responsible for about a third of all greenhouse gases and is a major contributor by biodiversity loss and extinctions. The livestock sector, we know from the most recent study earlier this year in Nature Food Journal, is responsible for about 20% of all global greenhouse gases. It's also a really large user of land and fresh water, and a cause of biodiversity loss and extinction. So being very concerned about these issues, I think this is the biggest global issue of our time. We are living through the sixth mass extinction event. Many people have been looking to plant-based diets as a way to address this, to decrease the impacts of the livestock sector. I was a small animal vet in clinical practice, mostly around London, for about a decade before I went into teaching at a vet school. And I had been wondering about what the effects might be of plant-based diets for cats and dogs, because clearly if they could be healthy on these diets and happy on these diets, then there could be some major environmental benefits. So that's how I started getting to studying this area. And I've been doing that for many years now, actually, for probably more than a decade.
Yeah, so kind of really at the, I guess, the cutting edge and at the forefront, because it's something that I guess there has been a lot more publicity about it of late, but it's been, yeah, only just being taken up, I guess. So yeah, it's good to know there's been a bit of background for that. I mean, speaking about the environmental impacts, a lot of people might be saying, well, okay, farming's a problem, and we recognize that there's a high ecological cost. It's not just carbon, it's all those other things that you're talking about with producing meat. But aren't we just using the kind of the byproducts that would otherwise be, thrown in the bin if we weren't feeding it to our dogs? So actually,
Yeah,
we're reducing waste rather than being part of the problem.
it would be great if that were true, because, as you say, it would kind of be recycling and it would be reducing waste. But unfortunately, that's less and less true as time passes. In the United Kingdom, for example, all the ingredients in pet food are ingredients that have also been approved for human consumption, whereas in other regions of the world, parts of the animal which are considered unfit for human consumption are recycled into pet food. And so there is less use of byproduct in places like the United Kingdom. And there are also two trends which are concerning. One is the increasing use of premium pet foods. So these are more likely to use better quality cuts of meat, which could also be consumed by people. And there is greater use of premium pet food over time, and it's part of a general trend to be providing better standards of care to our animals, which is great. People are expecting better standards as time passes. Over the very long term, we see so-called humanisation of pets. It's been said that dogs have, over a couple of generations, moved from the back garden into the living room, now up onto the bed. And many would say that's true. So we're increasingly seeing these animals as part of our own families, wanting better standards of care for them. And that translates into better quality pet foods, which means less use of byproducts. A second problem, I suppose, from the environmental perspective, is that pet ownership around the world is massively increasing. There are around 3 billion people out of a global population of about 7.8 billion who are consumers in developing nations who are rapidly increasing their income. So they've got more disposable income and they're adopting what they see as the affluent and desirable lifestyles of Westernized nations, and that includes more pet ownership. So we've got much more pet ownership occurring and much more use of premium pet foods around the world, which make less use of byproducts. So both of these things together equal a massive increase in the number of livestock animals that will be going into pet food, and consequently the environmental impacts of the livestock sector, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a kind of a figure or a split with how much kind of the impact is, human food versus our pet food?
That's a fantastic question. There was a key study from 2017 from University of California, Berkeley, looking at the environmental impacts of pet food in the United States. The United States is interesting because that's the nation with the greatest numbers of cats and dogs in the world, and also the most data available on these sorts of things. So they demonstrated that looking at the whole of the livestock sector, and we already know from other studies that that has really substantial environmental impacts. It's responsible for 20% of greenhouse gases, for example. Looking at the whole of the livestock sector, they calculated that pet food is responsible for 25 to 30% of the environmental impacts of the livestock sector. So that's of the land use, water use, fossil fuels, pesticides, fertilizers, and greenhouse gases. So that's really striking. There have been a couple of other studies since that have found similar results. For example, one looking at the ecological footprint of the average Japanese consumer, calculating that a medium-sized dog has a greater dietary ecological footprint than the average Japanese consumer. And of course, the Japanese consumer may be different from the American consumer or the New Zealand consumer and so on, but it does indicate that we have often underappreciated just how large are the dietary ecological footprints of our companion animals, particularly dogs, and particularly medium or large breed dogs, compared to those of humans. What hasn't really been done yet is to calculate what the environmental benefits would be if the world's dogs and cats switched on to, say, nutritionally sound vegan diets, or maybe something like yeast-based diets. So what I've started to do is to study that, and I've done some initial calculations, and they're actually very exciting. There are really major environmental benefits that would accrue, and it would make a real contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental concerns.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fairly compelling argument that says it's a big problem. We should all know, hopefully everyone listening to this knows, that we're, the ecological situation in front of us is, potentially very dire. And so it's on all of us, I think, to examine every element of our life to make changes where we're able to. And I guess there are exciting times ahead. There are new options available, because maybe if we go back 10, 15 years, if there were options, it was very much less mainstream. We didn't know quite so much about it, and that has changed. So I guess you also said that we've got the humanization, and I'd argue that actually a lot of dogs, they're actually under the duvet. They're not just on the bed. They really are part of the family. And so we are super keen on optimizing their health, whatever that means to each individual. And a big pushback I hear is, don't dogs need to eat meat to be healthy? Isn't that what people are wanting or thinking? And so how does your research, and I guess diving into your research, how does that, what do you say to that, broad?
Yeah, that's a completely understandable position, because dogs evolved from wolves some 20 to 40,000 years ago. They started to follow our hunter-gatherer ancestors around the landscape as we hunted animals. And they started to receive scraps from hunting parties, but also they received probably as much or more scraps from cooked starchy root vegetables, which was the staple diet of our ancestors. So those wolves that were able to, that had mutations that enabled them to derive nutritional benefit from cooked starchy root vegetables and other assorted scraps, did better than the wolves that did not have those mutations. And over time, the population changed, and we ended up with the modern domesticated dog, which is biologically an omnivore. It's not a carnivore. And this is interesting, of course, but it's actually very limited relevance to the modern house dog of today, that would eat a variety of body parts from animals that they would never naturally have consumed. Animals, I suppose, such as cows, chickens, and some other species, with all sorts of additives which are not natural either, packaged up into dry kibble or cans and fed at predictable times daily. None of this is very similar to the natural feeding regime of an ancestral dog. So what dogs need is not to match an ancestral feeding regime. That's very clear. What they need is biologically the set of nutrients that dogs require. in a formulation that's sufficiently palatable, i.e. tasty, so that the animals will be happy to eat it, and also sufficiently bioavailable, so that's primarily digestible, so that nutrients can get into the bloodstream and reach the cells. There's no scientific or biological requirement for them to have an ancestral diet or meat or any other particular ingredient for that matter. What they need is the right set of nutrients getting to the cells in their bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're matching that nutrient profile, regardless of source, regardless of ingredient, then we should be able to provide them with everything that they need to not just to survive, but to thrive and to stay healthy.
Yes, if we provide diets which are nutritionally complete and balanced, but potentially have less of some of the additives or dietary hazards that seem to be common in some meat-based pet foods, we might even see health advantages. And actually, that's what we've seen in our latest study. We've conducted this really large-scale study of more than 2,500 dogs on vegan pet food versus meat-based pet food. And we found that the dogs on the vegan diets did actually have certain advantages which seem to be consistent with not being exposed to certain dietary hazards. And there are two, actually. There are those associated potentially with animal allergens. So allergens associated with beef, lamb, pork, and we're seeing lower rates of gastrointestinal problems, skin problems, and ear problems in the dogs on the vegan diets. And the second cluster of apparent benefits relates, I think, to body weight. I would say that the biggest dietary hazard of pet food today is probably overnutrition. There was a very large study of more than 2,000 pet food brands from 5 US states a number of years ago that showed that deviations from labeling claims were very common and usually small, but occasionally more significant. And I think one of the most common problems was more calories in pet food than was on the labeling claims. We know that dogs being overweight and obese is probably one of the most common health disorders in dogs today, and associated with a range of other problems for them as well. And the dogs in our study, our very large-scale study on the meat-based diets, were more likely to suffer from being overweight, having musculoskeletal disorders, and mobility disorders. So there may be a couple of dietary hazards that dogs on the meat-based diets are being exposed to, which dogs on the vegan diets are not being exposed to, and that may explain why we're seeing those clusters of benefits for the vegans.
Yeah, and those are, I mean, those are huge conditions. Those are chronic conditions. Those are, quality of life impacting. They're not just a minor statistical difference, I guess, in a fairly insignificant condition, which is sometimes what we see. These are really that's a really impactful benefit for dogs that a switch potentially. It
certainly is. I remember being practicing as a vet in clinical practice around London, seeing so many of these poor dogs with this red itching inflamed skin, and so often the guardians unfortunately wouldn't understand that was a problem because the dogs had always been that way, and that the dog is in chronic discomfort, chronic itchiness, and often of course they have ear problems as well, the ears being a micro environment where these problems are often at their worst, and it's just such, it really was very sad, I suppose, to see these dogs in this condition long term that people were not really aware of, the guardians weren't aware of, and accordingly were not being treated for them. If we can prevent these kinds of problems by using some other diet which provides all the nutrients they need, but which doesn't include the triggers that would trigger these sorts of conditions, then that's got to be a really good thing. Indeed, the very first vegetarian or vegan dog foods were not created for any concerns for environmental impacts or the welfare of food animals. They were created as hypoallergenic diets, actually, as diets with less dietary allergens to try to address these sorts of problems, these skin problems and gastrointestinal problems and so on.
Yeah. So that was kind of their, I guess their origin, which is, fascinating. And I guess it's the, maybe there's, well, not necessarily a switch in importance of why they increasing in their uptake or people are thinking about it, but whatever reason well, if we're looking for healthier dogs, then it can only be a good thing if that is indeed what we're achieving. So I mean, that's a huge number of kind of pet guardians that you had the input from as well, and it was their kind of reporting on their own health of the kind of the health of their dogs and the number of vet visits that they were having, and kind of what kind of questions were you asking to kind of ascertain the health of those individual animals?
Yeah, we asked them about their own opinions of health, but we also asked for a range of more objective data as well. In fact, we looked at 7 general indicators of health. We looked at whether the guardians had been visiting vets an unusually high number of times in the last year, which might be consistent with treatment for an ongoing healthcare problem. We looked at how often they were using any kind of medication, how often they had had to progress onto a medical diet after initially being on a vegan or a meat-based diet. We also asked about the assessment of the veterinarians about health of their animals. And we also, for this group, we limited to people that had definitely seen their vet at least once in the last year and felt certain about the assessment of their vets. Anyone that felt unsure, we excluded from this part of the study.
Yeah.
We also looked at the prevalence of healthcare disorders, and for those animals that were unwell, we asked how many health disorders were they suffering from? Were they suffering from just one, or was it more than one? So those were our 7 general indicators. And on top of that, we looked at 22 of the most common health disorders faced by dogs as well. And we looked at how much all of these varied across the dietary groups that we studied.
Yeah. So that's that's a whole lot of data, and I can just imagine I'm not very good at statistics, so I can't even imagine all of the number crunching that went on behind that. But that sounds pretty comprehensive. And I guess one thing that we struggle with a lot in veterinary medicine is larger scale studies. Of any type. We're often talking about 2, 3, 4 individuals. So actually having the numbers that you are presumably therefore increases the power and the reliability of kind of this form of study.
Yes, so we have a very large scale studies, 2,536 dogs were included. The previous largest study had 12 dogs in it. As you say, the numbers are usually very small. So that gives us a high degree of statistical confidence in our results. So we are, very pleased that we're able to recruit so many pet guardians into the study, and as you say, statistics was a big part of this. I worked with 3 co-author colleagues, and all of them were statisticians, and they were all bringing their statistical expertise to bear. As a veterinarian, I also didn't do a lot of statistics in my studies or my time thereafter. So I have indeed worked with colleagues on that, and I'm grateful to their input.
Yeah, fantastic. So with all that said, so we've got potentially huge benefits with weight, with skin disease, with arthritis, with a whole range of different things. Is this the definitive study? Does this prove that the vegan diets are the healthiest options? Because I guess we're not just looking, can dogs thrive? And I mean, I think if we've got large reports of people feeding vegan diets without problems for long times, we can be fairly comfortable that dogs can survive on them. But is this the definitive proof that this is what everyone should be feeding their dog?
Yeah. I think it's rare in science that you can point to any one study about anything and say this is the definitive proof. As scientists, we all want to be skeptics, and we all want to critique everything and look for flaws as much as we can. And it's probably possible to critique virtually any study that's ever been done. But what we should be doing, I think, is not looking for absolute certainty or perfection, but rather considering the weight of evidence. And there are studies for and against the use of nutritionally sound vegan diets in dogs, and none of them are perfect. On the for side, we've got our recent study, which is very large scale, more than 2,500 dogs. We looked at a range of objective and more subjective data, a very big study. We've got a lot of statistical confidence, but it's not perfect. One thing we didn't do, for example, was take blood results, blood tests, and do clinical examinations on actual animals. We did rely upon information coming from guardians, and some of that will be incorrect, but there's no reason to believe that's more likely in any one dietary group than another. So that's our study. We've also got the study of 12 animals that was published in British Journal of Nutrition 2009. They were all sprint racing Siberian Huskies. They were examined physically by a vet, and blood samples were taken. They were subjected to extremely high exercise regime, pulling laden sleds through snow for weeks on end in competitive racing. And the ones on a plant-based diet did just as well as the ones on meat-based diet, but the sample size was 12, which is not sufficient to reliably extrapolate results to the entire population of dogs in the world.
No, but they're incredibly hardworking dogs. So if a husky could do well on it, they're probably the hardest working dog of all.
You're absolutely right. It's hard to think of any animals that might be exercising more than a sprint racing Siberian Husky dragging sleds through heavy snow for days on end. So that was a great group to be studying. There have been 2 unpublished master's theses by veterinary students using clinical examination blood results, finding that the vegan dogs did it as well or better. So that's the evidence in favour. There are these 4 studies. The evidence against is one study, which is 1987. The sample size was 8, so even smaller than the 12. And in this dog, there was 6 weeks of enforced rest, and then dogs had to run for 4 hours a day non-stop at 12 kilometres an hour on a treadmill for 2 weeks, which is a very unnatural exercise regime. It's nothing like the natural lifestyle of a domesticated dog today. The ones that were on a plant-based diet seem to have lower cholesterol in their bloodstream, and that seems to protect against anemia under such extreme exercise regimes. So the plant-based dogs ended up getting anemia in this study. So there you go. If we look at the studies for and against, they can all be critiqued, but I think the weight of evidence is very strongly in favour of the conclusion that nutritionally sound vegan diets provide health outcomes that are as good or better than those provided by meat-based diets. And that's not perfect, but it is I think we can be very strongly confident of that conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you say, there's, we all come with our own opinions, and but when you're talking about higher numbers, we start to balance things out to a certain extent. And if we're looking for the perfect study, we're going to be waiting for a long time. And but I mean, I say that because I know there has been kind of among the profession, I think veterinarians, we're a pretty conservative bunch, and like you say, we know what works, kind of, in inverted commas, maybe. So why change it? What would you like to see maybe in the future to help bring more people on board with this, this idea of that vegan feeding for dogs is not just okay, it's actually, potentially optimal?
Right. Veterinarians are not driving this change. As you've rightly said, they're a fairly conservative group. Unfortunately, it's a bit unscientific to prefer one's own personal experience and opinions to scientific evidence. And unfortunately, there is a lot of that amongst veterinarians. So, but as I say, I'm not too concerned because they're not driving this change. This change is being driven by consumers and pet food companies are following. So consumers are hugely more concerned than they used to be about the environmental impacts, but also health and well-being for themselves and their families, and even the welfare of farmed animals. And as a result of that, this sector is expanding very quickly at the moment. Pet food companies are sensing a business opportunity, providing diets that consumers want. The sector was valued at being worth $9 billion globally in 2020 and going up to $16 billion globally by 2028. That's before all of these new large-scale studies appear. So what needs to happen going forwards is we need to be studying the things I think that the consumers are concerned about. And in our survey of more than 4,000 pet guardians, we found the top 5 concerns, and they matched other studies as well. And that's the health of the companion animals, as you would expect, the nutritional soundness and quality of the different diets, palatability, and environmental sustainability. So we're systematically studying each of these areas and publishing the results. And we have done health outcomes in dogs, health outcomes in cats is forthcoming. There's already a large-scale study from Guelph Vet School in Canada that's published last year, which is super exciting in that area. So that's kind of already been addressed to some degree. We've addressed the dietary quality and nutritional soundness in another study that we published last year. We've addressed the palatability in a large-scale one that we published last year. We haven't done environmental impacts yet. That's coming at the moment. So we need to, I think, continue this work, get the remaining studies published. People are interested in studying other areas as well. There are clinical trials underway. There are plans to do studies into digestibility, into a survey of costs of different diets, different aspects. And as this information gets out to the consumer base, the pace of change is going to dramatically accelerate. And veterinarians hopefully will eventually overcome, to some degree, their own personal biases and become aware of and willing to consider the new scientific evidence as it emerges. Fundamentally, vets are scientists, and that is more powerful than their own personal biases, I hope and expect. That is the root of what we do and who we are. We are scientists.
Yeah, well, I guess it's all quite unfamiliar, and yeah, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of people's plates. So, maybe it doesn't get their full attention or the attention it deserves. I guess, like, just thinking about maybe switching just at the end to practical tips for pet parents who want to make the change or want to look into this more. Is there a vast range of diets available? Is there anything in particular that people should be looking for? I'm thinking there's been various scares with our peas, lentils, potato diets that that's a bit of an unknown, and people might be a bit cautious. So where can people go to start on this journey if they're just thinking about this for the first time?
Yeah, it varies depending on where you are. This is a really quickly growing field, and it's going to look very different in 5 years to how it looks today. In some places, there may not be any options available for people. In major cities, there might be several options available for people. What people need to be doing to ensure the health of their companion animals is make sure the diet is nutritionally sound, it's nutritionally complete and balanced, and it's of good quality. So I'd be checking the labelling claims of whatever you're feeding to make sure that the diet is nutritionally complete. Making sure it's coming from a reputable company that's hopefully working with experts such as veterinary nutritionists to formulate a diet which is nutritionally complete. I wouldn't be trying to make a homemade diet and add supplements yourself. It is possible to do that, but there have been quite a few studies showing that it's very difficult to get that right, and it's usually unfortunately done incorrectly. So I think it's not worth trying. I would go with an existing commercial company that is producing diets to good standards and hopefully can provide information about what steps they're taking to ensure the nutritional soundness of their products. It would be a red flag if a company didn't provide any such information and did not respond to any requests, for example. So those are the things. I'd ensure the labelling states that it is nutritionally complete. It's from a reputable company that hopefully can provide some information about steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I guess that's something that we should be thinking about regardless of what we're feeding, because there's a lot of manufacturers out there of every diet that maybe don't have the expertise or the care that we would demand if we knew all of the facts about things. So, Dr. Andrew, this has been a fantastic conversation. There's been a huge amount of information that we've spoken about today. Where can people go to read the study, to find out all of these the studies that you've published, and keep up to date with what's in the pipeline as well?
Sure. So I have a website, sustainablepetfood.info, and there's tabs for articles, which is where the studies are appearing, tabs for videos. I have a short video series for social media, and other information on the website. So that's I hope that will be very helpful to consumers, but also to vets potentially that are interested in reading about these studies.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, they make a fascinating read. I'd encourage everyone to go over to those links. I'll leave them in the show notes as well. Dr. Andrew, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to chat to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Have a great day.
So there are definitely some significant limitations to our knowledge and to this study in particular. And if you want to know my thoughts on the overall situation, then make sure you check out this video linked on screen to give you a summary of where we are and whether you should think of switching your dog. So make sure you tap on that video. And until the next time, I'm veterinarian Dr. Alex. This is Our Pet's Health, because they're family.